Hi, my name is Dave. I'm a compulsive eater and a member of OA90. I live in Alabama. I came over from AA, so had recovery experience with the steps and tools, a higher power, and various items, but my love affair with food had gotten to the point where I'd crossed that imaginary line from bad habit to powerless. I got sober in the early 90s and I loved 12-step recovery, my sponsor, service, everything involved with it. But at a certain point in my sobriety, I entered the military and my frequency at meetings lowered. I'd always had bad habits with food. I loved sugar, cakes, cookies, and ice cream and chocolate were my favorite and were always my default. I have a love affair with sandwich creams, and I never thought I was eating due to some deep emotional need. Both the AA literature and the OA literature say that it's not why we ate, but that we just couldn't control. In AA, I couldn't control the amount I drank when I did drink, and in OA, I couldn't, when I was a compulsive eater, I couldn't control the amount I ate when I did eat. And I found this to be true after a certain point in my life. And I think that point in my life was when I was on my first ship. I joined the Navy in the late 90s. I went to all my schooling. Everything was fine. I was very active in AA. But then I went to my first ship, and we were at sea 3 years out of the 4 that I was on that ship. And I lost contact with a lot of friends that I had in AA, and I turned to food for comfort. And it wasn't really comfort, it was just something I did. I drove around. My modus operandi was primarily driving around in my car with cookies and goodies on my passenger seat and milk in the console, and I would sit there and just eat and drive all around the town that I was living in. I would just drive. It was a really big city, and I would just drive and eat, stop at stores and get stuff. And eventually, I went from 212 pounds up to 255. The Navy was pretty lenient at the time, but from about 2002 to 2010, they started firing people that were overweight for an extended period of time, and I sort of became one of those people. I was always riding that razor's edge of failure. So anyways, I have left sea duty at about 260 and went to Massachusetts where I was going to do my shore duty. I was in Boston, and I was very active in AA, did service work in treatment centers and stuff like that, and I found a friend, and she would often talk about her exercise bulimia. She loved to eat like me, but she was thin, but she controlled her eating through constant exercise. I think she even had like a stair stepper in her bedroom, and she would just get on that thing. It was crazy. And I would talk about my unhealthy relationship with food with her, about my compulsive eating, my body image, obsession. This is an early memory from when I was about 14. I was sitting on the deck at my house. It was summer. We were having burgers. It was a normal dinner, normal family life. And I remember looking down at my stomach, because I had my shirt off. It was the summer. And I remember looking at the natural folds of my stomach and thinking, oh, that's so disgusting. Why am I so fat? And I just, from like that point on, for like the next 30 years, I held in my stomach. I just held in my stomach. It was natural for me. I just wanted to hide my fat stomach, and it wasn't really even that bad. I was a normal sized kid. But for some reason, somehow, I had this fat shame inside of me, and I've always had an unhealthy body image. Anyways, we were talking about our bad relationship with food, and we had talked about going to an OA meeting, and I decided to just jump right on it. And I found a meeting in north of Boston, and I went there, and it was like the first time I went to an AA meeting. I was just astounded that these people not only talked about their problems with food, but they had a way out on which we could all agree, and it seemed logical. And I saw a guy there who had been abstinent off from compulsive eating for a long time, and he seemed to have his stuff together, and I knew the importance of sponsorship, so I immediately asked him to be my sponsor. And he said, hey, meet me at this meeting tomorrow morning, and we'll talk about the program after the meeting. So we did the meeting the next morning, and we sat in his car, and I remember distinctly, he was like, hey, Dave, I appreciate you asking me to be your sponsor. What we do, in OA90, because I'd gone to OA meetings, but I'd actually fallen into a OA How meeting, which has now since become 90-day meetings. And he said, we weigh and measure our food. You commit your food to me 3 times a day. This will be your food plan. We don't do flour, sugar, caffeine, or artificial sweeteners. And I was like, he's like, you need to buy a digital scale, some measuring cups, and some measuring spoons. And I was like, dang, wow, that's a lot, you know what I mean? But I was desperate, and I had surrendered, and I said, I'll do it. I'll do anything. And that willingness really helped me, and I started working the program. I started, in addition to my membership in AA, I started going to OA90 meetings, and people in there would share that it was very clear on how OA90 considered abstinence to be 3 weighed and measured meals committed to a sponsor, no flour, no sugar, and at that time, no artificial sweeteners or caffeine. Since then, the caffeine and artificial sweeteners things has kind of let off a little bit, but there's still some pretty hardliners out there, some old timers that like to do that. So I just started going to meetings and working the program. A big way that we do it in OA90 is through the 9 tools of OA. So meetings, sponsorship, a plan of eating, literature, anonymity, service, writing, telephone. These are all important terms. So they would say you need to make your 3 phone calls a day to another member. You need to write down your food, give it to your sponsor, have a plan of eating, 3 weighed measured meals, no flour, no sugar. And then along, you eventually get in this routine. The reason they call it 90-day program is you can't share at meetings until you have 90 days. And I used to have a problem with that, but I kind of understood it. Once I hit my 90 days, I was clear, and and people also realize that if you're going to make it 90 days, and there's a good chance you're going to stick around. You know what I mean? People that may just be looking at it as a diet or not as a way of life will probably not make it 90 days. So that 90 days dividing line is important. And that's why they call us 90-day program. But when I think of 90-day program, I think of a lot more, and primarily the weighing, measuring, committing the food to a sponsor, no flour, no sugar at the least. But you'd think that would be a problem, but it's not. It actually freed me. I learned a lot about my powerlessness, and my food recovery has been an interesting journey. Since I was traveling so much in the Navy, I didn't stay abstinent. The first time I got about 4 years, and I got away from OA90, which was then centered in the Northeast, and I was traveling a lot with the military. I had a young family. I give you all these excuses, but the reality is that the insanity of compulsive eating returned. Unlike AA, where I can give up alcohol for life and never have to really deal with alcohol, in OA, I have to take the lion out of the cage 3 times a day. That's what people say, and I think that's a very apt description. But my permanent recovery does come through the steps, and through the tools, and my plan of eating, and my relationship with my sponsor, service. Everything works together, but definitely my higher power. There was a long time in the program where I looked at the tools and the steps in OA as merely a checklist. And I used to wonder, like, where does my program end and my relationship with my higher power and my higher power removing the obsession for food from me begin? And there was a time most recently, I'd been abstinent this time from compulsive eating for about 10 months. And probably about 3 months in, I was slacking off on my tools. I was really, abstinence was a priority in my life, but life was getting in the way, and I was slacking off. And plus, I'm human, and that's why I need God, because I'm human and I will fail. But I was slacking off a little bit, and I always felt like God's presence with my addictions was sort of like when you go to a zoo and you have that huge plexiglass cage, and you got the lion on one side, you got the thick plexiglass, and then you got me on the other side. And one day I woke up and the lion was on my bed. He was leashed, and I felt like God was at the end of that other end of the leash, and he's like, "All right, Dave, you want to slack off? I can only hold this tiger at bay for so long." And I had the food thoughts, but they didn't. I had a lot of food thoughts. I had a semi-food obsession, but the desire in me to eat wasn't there. And I realized that God was keeping it at a bay. And I need to do my part by keep doing the tools, staying active in the program, work my steps, live the program, and change and be open to God's will. And I realized that the program isn't just a checklist. It's a way of life. So it's a combination of that muscle memory of the wax on, wax off, doing my tools daily and staying in the middle of the program, but also building this relationship with God, because ultimately my higher power is the one that's keeping me free from food addiction. And what my day looks like every day, I get up in the morning, I write down my food. I have a little text file on my computer. I'll get up, I write down my food. I'll read one of the reflections from one of the reflections books. I'll write on it. I don't always agree with them, but I'll write on it, or I'll write what's going on in my life. And then I do a tools inventory. And then once I'm done with that, I email that whole thing to my sponsor. And then later on in the afternoon, around 4:30 p.m., I'll call my sponsor and we'll talk about what's going on. And that's my routine for sponsorship and the tools. I also read the literature daily, whether it's a reflection book, the AA Big Book, the OA 12 and 12, or whatever. I do that. I'm also very active in service. I do public information. I work with newcomers. I sponsor people, and service keeps me in the middle of the program. Sometimes people say that recovery is like a record on a record player, if anybody remembers what that is. And if you're on the edge just going around, it's so easy to fall off. But service gets me in the middle of that record. So as it's spinning, if I start to slack off, it takes a long time to drift toward the edge and I won't fall off. So service keeps me active in the program. I lost the weight this time within 3 months. I came in at like 220, resigned to have love handles for the rest of my life. And once I got off of flour and sugar again, I saw myself for what I really was, a saggy, middle-aged man who needed to be much healthier. But I had the willingness to work the program, and I've been abstinent from compulsive eating for about 10 months. I've released about 30 pounds this time. My total release since coming into OA90 20 years ago has been about 70 pounds. I'm very grateful to be abstinent, and I'm working my program one day at a time. That's all I'm guaranteed is just today. And hopefully you could find a home in OA90 like I did and get freedom from your compulsive eating. Thanks.